Arranged marriages in high society usually involve trade routes or oil rights. Jonathan's marriage bought his father a clean slate at a high-stakes poker table. He was handed over with nothing but a battered suitcase and the sour scent of fear clinging to his collar. Gossip painted the Duke of Aldridge as a monster, a scarred, frigid alpha who chewed through omegas and spat them out. Jonathan stood on the stone steps of the gargantuan estate, waiting for the beast. Jonathan's coat was too thin for October. The wool was entirely worn at the elbows, the threads completely giving way to the biting autumn wind. He kept his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring at the scuff marks on his leather boots. Inside the drafty study of the Mercer family home, his father was laughing. It was that boisterous, wet laugh Richard Mercer only used when he was either completely drunk or entirely relieved of a massive burden. Today, it was both. Jonathan didn't need to hear the exact words being exchanged through the cracked oak door. He already knew the terms. The Mercer family had been bleeding money for a decade. The cars had been sold. The summer house was foreclosed. The servants had been dismissed one by one until only Mrs. Gable remained, and she stayed out of pity rather than for a paycheck. Jonathan, a 22-year-old Omega with a weak constitution and a quiet demeanor, was the very last asset Richard had to liquidate. The heavy oak door swung open. A man in a sharp, charcoal-gray suit stepped out. He wasn't the Duke. He was a lawyer, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and alpha pheromones tightly leashed under chemical suppressants. "Mr. Mercer," the lawyer said, not looking at Richard, but directly down at Jonathan, sitting on the hallway bench. "The car's waiting. His Grace prefers punctuality." Jonathan stood up. His knees popped in the quiet hall. He picked up his single battered leather suitcase. It contained 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, a handful of undergarments, and a worn paperback novel. That was the sum total of his life. Richard stumbled out of the study, a glass of amber liquid sloshing in his hand. "Chin up, Jonathan. You're a duke's consort now. Do your duty. Keep your legs open and your mouth shut, and he won't send you back." Jonathan didn't look at his father. He couldn't. If he looked at the man, the fragile dam holding back his panic would break. He just nodded, his throat tight, and followed the lawyer out into the freezing, damp air. The car was a massive black sedan with tinted windows. The driver, a beta with a completely neutral expression, opened the door for him. Jonathan slid into the back seat. The leather was pristine, butter soft, and smelled faintly of ozone and cedar, the lingering scent of an alpha. The alpha. Gideon Hawke, Duke of Aldridge. Jonathan wrapped his arms around his middle as the car pulled away from the curb. He didn't look back at the rotting Victorian house he had grown up in. The drive took 2 hours. As the city melted into dense, sprawling forests, Jonathan's mind raced through every rumor he had ever heard about Gideon Hawke. The man had earned his title and fortune not through inheritance, but through ruthless corporate acquisitions. He was a phantom in high society. He rarely attended galas. When he did, people parted for him like the Red Sea. They said his face was ruined. They said he had a temper that could shatter glass. They said his last Omega had gone mad from the isolation of the Aldridge estate. Jonathan was small, standing at a mere 5'5". He got winded climbing too many stairs due to a childhood bout of pneumonia that had scarred his lungs. He didn't have the strength to fight off a violent alpha. He didn't have the emotional fortitude to survive a cruel one. His scent, usually a mild, pleasant vanilla, was currently soured by anxiety, smelling like burnt sugar. He tried to breathe through his mouth to ignore his own distress. The car slowed. Huge wrought iron gates swung open on silent hinges. The estate came into view. It wasn't a fairy tale castle. It was a sprawling, modern fortress of dark stone and massive glass windows, sitting on the edge of a cliff overlooking a churning gray sea. It looked cold. It looked entirely unforgiving. The car stopped at the front steps. The driver opened the door. The wind off the ocean immediately bit through Jonathan's thin coat. He gripped the handle of his suitcase until his knuckles turned white, stepped out onto the gravel, and prepared to meet his buyer. The massive oak front doors opened before Jonathan even reached the top step. A tall, austere woman in a black dress stood in the entryway. She was an elderly beta, her gray hair pulled back into a severe bun. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Mrs. Hughes, the head housekeeper. Please come inside out of the wind." Jonathan stepped over the threshold. The interior was overwhelmingly vast. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and floors of polished slate. It was minimalist to the point of feeling empty, yet every single piece of furniture clearly cost more than Jonathan's entire childhood home. "I will take your bag," Mrs. Hughes said, reaching out. Jonathan flinched, clutching the suitcase tighter. No, thank you, I can carry it." Mrs. Hughes paused. Her sharp eyes softened just a fraction. "Very well. His Grace is waiting for you in the west drawing room. Follow me." Jonathan's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every footstep echoed too loudly. The air in the house was heavy with that same scent from the car, cedar and a sharp electric tang of ozone. It was an alpha's territorial marker, so potent it made Jonathan's knees weak. He forced himself to keep walking. Mrs. Hughes stopped before a set of double doors. She didn't knock. She just opened them and stepped aside. Jonathan walked in. The drawing room was walled with books on one side and floor-to-ceiling glass on the other, looking out over the churning ocean. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth. A man was standing by the window, his back to the door. He held a crystal glass in one hand. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hughes murmured, "Mr. Mercer has arrived." She stepped back and pulled the doors shut, leaving Jonathan completely alone with him. The man turned. Gideon Hawk was massive. He stood well over 6 feet, his shoulders broad enough to block out the gray light from the window. He wore a dark navy sweater and tailored trousers, lacking the stuffy suits Jonathan expected of a duke. His hair was dark and slightly unkempt, threaded with premature silver at the temples. Then Jonathan saw his face, a jagged, pale scar cut down from his left cheekbone, crossing his jaw and disappearing into the collar of his sweater. It gave him an inherently brutal look, but it was his eyes that froze Jonathan in place. They were a piercing, cold slate gray. They locked onto Jonathan, entirely unreadable. Jonathan stopped breathing. His grip on the suitcase slipped, and it hit the floor with a dull thud. Gideon didn't flinch. He set his glass down on a side table. The clink of crystal on wood sounded like a gunshot. He took a step forward. Jonathan instinctively took a step back, hitting the heavy wooden doors behind him. He squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away, bracing for a blow, a harsh word, a dominant alpha command forcing him to his knees. His lungs burned. He needed to breathe, but his chest was entirely locked up. Silence stretched. 1 second. 2. 5. "Look at me." The voice was a deep, gravelly baritone. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a command wrapped in alpha pheromones. It was just a request, spoken quietly. Jonathan slowly opened his eyes. Gideon had stopped 10 feet away. He hadn't closed the distance. He stood perfectly still, his hands in his pockets. "You are shaking," Gideon said. It was a statement of fact, devoid of judgment. I'm sorry, Your Grace," Jonathan stammered, his voice cracking. "It's cold outside." Gideon frowned. The movement made his scar pull sharply. He looked at Jonathan's threadbare coat. His gaze dropped to the battered suitcase on the floor, then back up to Jonathan's pale, frightened face. "My name is Gideon," he said flatly. "You will not call me Your Grace. You will not apologize for the weather." Jonathan swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. Not sir, either." Gideon sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to rattle in his broad chest. "You are exhausted. Your scent is souring the room." Jonathan flushed hot with deep, immediate shame. An Omega's scent turning sour was a sign of distress, but in polite society it was considered entirely vulgar to mention it. He tried to rein it in, to pull his distress back, but he was too tired. "I apologize. I'll I'll try to control it." Gideon looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then he reached over and pulled a velvet bell cord by the fireplace. A moment later, the doors opened, and Mrs. Hughes appeared. "Show Jonathan to his rooms," Gideon instructed, not looking away from Jonathan. "Have a hot meal brought up. Something light, broth and bread." Jonathan blinked. "His rooms? Plural?" "Yes, Gideon," Mrs. Hughes said. Gideon finally looked away, turning back to the storm raging outside the window. "I will see you tomorrow, Jonathan. Get some sleep." It was a dismissal. There was no demand for an evening consummation, no rough claiming, no dragging him to a marital bed to stamp a bite into his neck. Jonathan scrambled to pick up his suitcase. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if Gideon even heard him over the crackle of the fire. Jonathan's suite was larger than the entire ground floor of his father's house. Mrs. Hughes led him into a space decorated in soft creams and warm golds. There was a sitting room, a massive bathroom with a cloth foot tub, and a bedroom featuring a king-sized bed piled high with down comforters. A fire was already burning cheerfully in the grate. "Your luggage can be unpacked later," Mrs. Hughes said, noticing Jonathan still white-knuckling the leather handle. "The kitchen is sending up chicken broth and fresh bread. Eat it. You look half-starved." Before Jonathan could thank her, she was gone, shutting the heavy door behind her. Jonathan stood in the middle of the plush rug. He felt like an intruder. He carefully set his suitcase on a small bench at the foot of the bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress. It was impossibly soft. 10 minutes later, a young beta maid knocked, wheeled in a silver cart, and left without a word. Jonathan ate the broth. It was rich, savory, and completely settled his rolling stomach. After eating, he changed into his pajamas, flannel, washed so many times they were practically translucent. He climbed into the massive bed and pulled the heavy duvet up to his chin. He waited. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the doorknob to turn. Alphas were territorial. They were driven by biology. Gideon had bought him. A man didn't pay off $1 million gambling debt for a roommate. He would come. Jonathan just had to endure it. He just had to lie still and let it happen. The clock on the mantel ticked. Midnight. 1 in the morning. 2. Jonathan's eyelids grew heavy. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The storm outside lashed rain against the thick glass. He kept jolting awake at every creak of the house, his heart pounding, his breath shallow. By 3 in the morning, the exhaustion of the day, combined with the lingering warmth of the room and the food in his belly, dragged him under. He woke to the smell of coffee. Jonathan bolted upright. Sunlight was streaming through the heavy curtains. He panicked, looking frantically around the room, expecting to find Gideon sitting in a chair, watching him. The room was empty. He checked himself. He was perfectly fine, untouched. The door was still securely shut. A soft knock made him jump. "Come in," he rasped, his throat dry. The door opened. It wasn't the maid. It was Gideon. The massive alpha was carrying a wooden tray. He stepped into the room, his slate eyes scanning Jonathan briefly before looking away to give him privacy. Gideon walked over to the small table by the window and set the tray down. "It is 9 o'clock, Gideon said, his voice a low rumble. "I assumed you would sleep longer, but I heard you moving." Jonathan clutched the duvet to his chest. "I'm sorry, I should be up. I didn't know what time you wanted me to—" He trailed off, entirely unsure of what his duties even were in this house. Gideon poured a cup of coffee from a silver carafe. "There are no schedules here. You sleep when you are tired. You eat when you are hungry." He turned and looked at Jonathan. His gaze lingered for a moment on the thin, practically worn-through fabric of Jonathan's pajama top. Gideon's jaw tightened. He walked to a massive mahogany wardrobe against the wall, pulled it open, and rummaged for a moment. He pulled out a heavy, dark gray cashmere sweater. He walked over to the bed and tossed it lightly. It landed softly on Jonathan's lap. "Put that on," Gideon said gruffly. "The central heating in this wing is ancient. You will freeze. Jonathan stared at the sweater. It was clearly Gideon's. It was huge, smelling strongly of cedar and ozone. The scent was incredibly potent, completely saturated with the alpha's calming pheromones. To an Omega, wearing an alpha's scent-drenched clothing was a highly intimate, profoundly comforting act. It signaled protection, it signaled safety. Jonathan's hand shook as he picked it up. He pulled it over his head. The cashmere was unimaginably soft. The sweater swallowed him whole, the hem dropping to his mid-thigh, the sleeves hanging past his fingertips. The scent surrounded him, immediately lowering his racing heart rate. He took a deep, involuntary breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. Gideon watched him for a second longer, a strange, unreadable expression flashing across his scarred face. Then he cleared his throat and looked at the breakfast tray. "There is toast, eggs, and fruit," Gideon said, turning toward the door. "Eat. I will have a tailor brought to the house this afternoon to measure you for proper clothes." "Wait," Jonathan blurted out before he could stop himself. Gideon paused, his hand on the doorknob. He looked back over his shoulder. Why didn't you come to my room last night?" Jonathan asked. The question hung in the air, blunt and terrifying. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could swallow the words. Gideon turned fully around. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He looked at Jonathan, a tiny fragile Omega drowning in his sweater, smelling of fear and vanilla. "Did you want me to?" Gideon asked quietly. Jonathan's breath hitched. "No," he whispered honestly. "Then there is your answer," Gideon said. He opened the door. "Eat your breakfast, Jonathan. No one is going to touch you here." The door clicked shut. Jonathan sat in the quiet room, completely surrounded by the warm, protective scent of a monster who had just made sure he was fed and warm. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face in the soft cashmere, and for the first time in 10 years, he let out a long, shaky breath and didn't feel entirely alone. The tailor arrived precisely at 2 in the afternoon. He was a small, bustling beta named Mr. Harrison, flanked by an assistant lugging 3 massive leather trunks. They took over the west drawing room, transforming the austere space into a chaotic sea of fabric swatches, measuring tapes, and pinning cushions. Jonathan stood in the center of the room, wearing only his trousers and a thin undershirt. He felt entirely exposed. He kept his arms pinned to his sides, shivering slightly despite the roaring fire. Gideon was in the room. That was the worst part. The Duke sat in a high-backed leather wing chair in the corner, a newspaper open on his lap. He hadn't said a word since introducing Mr. Harrison. He just sat there, occasionally turning a page, the rustle of the paper sending spikes of anxiety straight up Jonathan's spine. "Now, Your Grace," Mr. Harrison chirped, looping a yellow measuring tape around Jonathan's narrow chest. The tailor frowned. 32 inches. Very slight. We will need to build the shoulders up a fraction on the formal coats to give a proper silhouette." "No." Gideon didn't look up from the financial pages. His voice was quiet, but it stopped the tailor dead in his tracks. Mr. Harrison swallowed. "No padding, Your Grace?" "No padding," Gideon repeated, turning a page. "He is not a mannequin to be stuffed into society's mold. Cut the coats to fit him exactly as he is. Do not hide him." Jonathan stared at the floorboards. A hot, confusing flush crept up his neck. Do not hide him. In his father's house, Jonathan's frailty had been a point of shame. He was routinely stuffed into heavy, overly structured blazers to make him look more like a proper Omega, something robust enough to bear heirs and manage estates. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Very good, sir. Let us look at fabrics, Mr. Mercer. For everyday trousers, perhaps a durable worsted wool, in charcoal and navy." The tailor held up a stiff, heavy swatch of dark gray material. Jonathan reached out and touched it. It was rough. It would chafe his knees raw within an hour, but it looked cheap, and more importantly, it looked durable. "That is fine," Jonathan said softly. "Just a few pairs. I don't need much. Put that away, Harrison," Gideon rumbled. He finally folded the newspaper and set it on the side table. He stood up, closing the distance between the corner and the center of the room in 3 long strides. Jonathan instinctively flinched, his shoulders pulling inward. Gideon noticed. The alpha stopped a respectful 3 feet away. He reached past Jonathan and snatched the worsted wool from the tailor's hand, dropping it onto a nearby chair with a look of mild disgust. His skin is paper thin, Gideon said, looking directly at the tailor, not at Jonathan. That wool will tear him up. Cashmere blends for the trousers, silk linings for every jacket, Egyptian cotton for the undergarments and nightwear. Mr. Harrison's eyes widened. Your Grace, cashmere trousers for daily wear? The expense... Did I ask for a ledger, Harrison? Or did I ask for clothes? Clothes, Your Grace. Right away. The tailor scrambled back to his trunks, his assistant frantically flipping through a book of premium swatches. Jonathan's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked up at Gideon. The alpha was terrifyingly large up close. The scar on his face was jagged and violently white against his tanned skin. I can't, Jonathan whispered. His voice trembled. I can't pay you back for that. I don't have a dowry. My father... He choked on the words, the humiliation burning his throat. I don't have anything. Gideon looked down. His slate-gray eyes were intense, pinning Jonathan in place. Are you a debtor, Jonathan? No, I mean, my father... I did not marry your father, Gideon interrupted smoothly. I married you. You're my husband. In this house, you do not carry ledgers. You do not owe debts. You require clothing. Therefore, clothing is purchased. He reached out. Jonathan braced himself, expecting a harsh grip, a display of ownership. Instead, Gideon's large, calloused fingers lightly brushed the frayed collar of Jonathan's undershirt. The touch was so brief it was almost a ghost, but the heat of it seared right through the thin cotton. You will never wear threadbare cloth again, Gideon said. It wasn't a romantic vow. It was a statement of pure, immovable fact. He turned and walked back to his chair, picking up his newspaper. Continue, Harrison, and ensure the winter coats are lined in down. He feels the cold. Jonathan stood perfectly still. The tape measure wrapped around his waist felt entirely inconsequential. He was drowning in the heavy cedar scent of an alpha who saw his fragility not as a defect, but as something to be accommodated. It took 4 days for the panic to begin subsiding into a dull, manageable ache. Jonathan spent his time exploring the Aldridge estate. It was massive, silent, and incredibly empty. There were no chattering socialites, no endless streams of sycophants trying to curry favor with the Duke. There was only a skeleton crew of highly efficient, remarkably quiet staff. Jonathan quickly realized Gideon was a ghost in his own home. The alpha left his suite before dawn, usually retreating to his study or the eastern wing of the estate, only appearing for evening meals. On the 5th afternoon, a coastal storm broke. The sky bruised purple and gray, and the wind began to howl, battering the thick windows of the estate. Jonathan felt trapped. The walls of his suite were closing in. He needed to walk. He pulled on one of the new garments that had arrived that morning, a thick, oversized knit sweater in a soft cream color. It was absurdly soft, sinking against his skin like a warm cloud. He wandered down to the ground floor, intending to visit the library, but a side door at the end of the long stone corridor caught his eye. It was slightly ajar, a warm, humid draft spilling out into the cold hallway. Jonathan pushed it open and stepped through. The air changed instantly. The biting chill of the stone manor vanished, replaced by a thick, earthy heat. He had stepped into a massive Victorian glass house. It was an architectural marvel of wrought iron and arched glass panes clinging to the side of the cliff face, but it wasn't a pleasure garden. There were no manicured rose bushes or exotic orchids. It was wild. Ferns grew in massive, chaotic clusters. Thick vines crawled up the iron pillars. Rows of wooden tables held terracotta pots filled with hardy coastal shrubs, medicinal herbs, and dark, nutrient-rich soil. It smelled heavily of damp earth, crushed leaves, and rain. At the far end of the glass house, someone was working. Jonathan stepped quietly down the slate path. As he drew closer, he realized it was Gideon. The Duke had stripped down to a plain white t-shirt and work trousers. His sleeves were pushed up, revealing thick, corded forearms covered in a light dusting of dark hair and several old faded scars. He was bent over a wooden table, carefully repotting a fragile-looking fern. His hands, usually so imposing, moved with startling precision and care. Jonathan watched, mesmerized. The terrifying alpha of Aldridge, the ruthless businessman who could break a rival conglomerate over his knee, was gently patting dirt around a root system so he wouldn't damage the delicate fronds. A heavy gust of wind hit the glass house, rattling the panes. Gideon paused, his head tilting. Without turning around, he spoke. "You should not be out here, Jonathan. The temperature drops rapidly near the glass when the wind picks up." Jonathan froze. He had made absolutely no noise. "How did you know I was here?" Gideon finally turned. He wiped his soiled hands on a rag hanging from his belt. He looked at Jonathan, his gaze sweeping over the oversized cream sweater. "Vanilla," he said simply. "You smell like vanilla and old paper from the library corridor." Jonathan felt his cheeks heat. He reached up, self-consciously rubbing the scent gland on the side of his neck. Gideon tossed the rag aside and picked up a watering can. "Did you need something?" "No," Jonathan said quickly. "I was just exploring. I can leave." "You do not have to leave." Gideon poured water into the freshly potted fern. "This is your home. You have access to every room in it." Jonathan hesitated. The urge to flee back to the safety of his suite warred with a sudden, desperate curiosity. He took a few steps closer, stopping on the opposite side of the wooden potting table. I thought a duke's garden would have flowers," Jonathan murmured, looking at the practical, rugged plants. Gideon scoffed quietly. "Flowers die at the first frost. They require constant, exhaustive maintenance just to look pretty for a few weeks before they rot. I have no use for things that cannot survive the climate." Jonathan flinched. The words hit a little too close to home. Was that how Gideon saw him? A fragile, useless thing that couldn't survive? Gideon caught the flinch. His jaw tightened. He set the watering can down with a soft thump. He leaned forward, resting his large hands flat on the table, putting himself at eye level with Jonathan. "I was talking about the botany, Jonathan," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling register that vibrated right through Jonathan's chest. "Not you," Jonathan swallowed. "I am fragile, though. My lungs, I get sick. I'm not strong. I can't give you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't say the words strong airs. Gideon looked at him for a long, heavy moment. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the glass above them. But inside, the air felt incredibly still. "Do you know how I got this?" Gideon asked, reaching up and tapping a finger against the jagged scar on his cheek. Jonathan shook his head slowly. The rumors said it was a knife fight, a duel, a violent outburst of alpha rage. "A car accident," Gideon said bluntly. 10 years ago, shrapnel from the windshield. It shattered my jaw, tore through the muscle. The doctor said I would likely lose the eye. I didn't, but it left me hideous." He dropped his hand. "Society hates things that are broken. They look at this scar and see a monster." He looked at Jonathan's chest, right where his scarred lungs struggled to take deep breaths. "You have scars on the inside. I have them on the outside," Gideon said softly. "I did not bring you here to breed prize-winning thoroughbreds. I brought you here because you were drowning in that decaying house, and I had the means to pull you out." Jonathan's breath hitched. A knot in his chest, one he had carried for a decade, suddenly cracked. "Go back inside, Jonathan," Gideon said, picking up a small trowel. "Mrs. Hughes is making tea. Drink it while it is hot." Jonathan didn't move for a second. He just stared at the alpha. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back toward the heavy wooden door. As he pulled it open, he glanced back over his shoulder. Gideon was back to work, gently pressing soil around a fragile stem, keeping it anchored against the coming storm. The consequences of his arrival day finally caught up to Jonathan on a Tuesday evening. It started as a dull ache in his joints. By 4 o'clock, his chest felt tight, a familiar, terrifying pressure building behind his ribs. By 6 o'clock, he was shivering violently, despite sitting practically on top of the radiator in his room. He was supposed to join Gideon for dinner at 7. It would be their first formal meal together in the main dining hall. Panic set in. If he canceled, if he showed weakness so early into the arrangement, Gideon would realize he had purchased damaged goods. The Alpha's words in the greenhouse had been reassuring, but a lifetime of conditioning in the Mercer household wasn't erased by one conversation. Richard Mercer used to lock Jonathan in the cellar when he was sick, claiming the sound of his coughing ruined dinner parties. Jonathan forced himself out of a chair. His legs shook. He dressed in one of the new formal outfits, a tailored pair of dark trousers and a soft, slate blue silk button-down. He splashed cold water on his flushed face, slapped his cheeks to hide the feverish pallor, and marched downstairs. The dining hall was intimidating. A massive mahogany table sat under a crystal chandelier. Gideon was already seated at the head, nursing a glass of dark red wine. A place was set immediately to his right. "Good evening," Jonathan rasped. His throat felt like it was coated in broken glass. Gideon looked up. He frowned instantly. He set the wine glass down. Jonathan rigidly pulled out his chair and sat down. He kept his hands in his lap, clenching them together to stop the tremors. "I apologize if I'm late." "You are not late," Gideon said. He didn't look at the empty plates. He was staring intensely at Jonathan. Jonathan tried to smile, but it felt like his face was cracking. He took a shallow breath, trying to suppress the tickle in his lungs. A footman entered, setting down a bowl of rich, creamy lobster bisque in front of Jonathan. The smell hit him like a physical blow. His stomach roiled violently. He picked up his spoon with a shaking hand, determined to force it down. He dipped it into the soup. He lifted it to his mouth. He didn't make it. A violent, rattling cough tore its way up his throat. He dropped the spoon. It clattered loudly against the china bowl, splashing hot bisque onto the pristine white tablecloth. Jonathan turned his head away, burying his face in a heavy linen napkin as his body was racked by deep, wet coughs. His lungs burned. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. The scent of burnt sugar and sour panic flooded the room. "I'm sorry," Jonathan choked out, gasping for air. I'm sorry. I'll leave. I'll go back to my room." He pushed his chair back, his legs failing him completely. His knee caught the edge of the table, and he stumbled, bracing himself against the high back of the chair to keep from hitting the floor. He expected shouting. He expected the harsh, demanding roar of an alpha whose dinner had been ruined. Instead, a chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Before Jonathan could take a step, Gideon was there. The alpha completely ignored the spilled soup. He didn't call for a servant. He just closed the distance, wrapping one massive arm around Jonathan's waist and pulling him tight against his chest. Jonathan weakly tried to push him away. "I'm sick. You'll get sick. Please." "Stop talking," Gideon ordered. It wasn't a cruel command. It was a rough plea. Gideon reached up and pressed the back of his hand against Jonathan's forehead. The alpha cursed softly under his breath. Without another word, Gideon bent his knees, scooped Jonathan up, and lifted him into his arms. Jonathan gasped, instinctively wrapping his arms around Gideon's thick neck. The alpha carried him like he weighed absolutely nothing. "Mrs. Hughes!" Gideon's voice echoed like thunder through the dining hall. The head housekeeper appeared instantly in the doorway. "Call Dr. Evans," Gideon barked, striding past her toward the grand staircase. "Tell him to get here immediately. Bring cold water and clean cloths to my suite." Jonathan's hazy mind snagged on the words. My suite. He was too weak to protest as Gideon carried him up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The alpha's chest was a solid wall of heat. His heart beat a steady, thumping rhythm against Jonathan's side. Most importantly, Gideon was flooding the air with his scent. Alpha pheromones, when used aggressively, could force an omega to their knees, but when used protectively, they were a narcotic. The heavy, rich scent of cedar and ozone wrapped around Jonathan, acting like a physical blanket. It forced his racing heart to slow. It eased the suffocating panic in his chest. Gideon carried him into a massive bedroom in the east wing. It was sparsely decorated, dominated by a gigantic four-poster bed. Gideon laid Jonathan down on the mattress. The sheets smelled intensely of the alpha. Jonathan shivered violently, his teeth chattering as the fever spiked. He curled into a tight ball. Gideon didn't leave. He sat on the edge of the mattress. He reached out and began unbuttoning Jonathan's silk shirt. Jonathan weakly grabbed Gideon's wrist. "Don't," he whispered. "I'm disgusting right now. I'm broken." Gideon paused. He looked down at Jonathan's pale, sweating face. His slate eyes were entirely devoid of disgust. They were filled with a fierce, terrifying focus. "You are not broken," Gideon said firmly, gently prying Jonathan's fingers away from his wrist. "You are sick, and I am going to take care of you." He finished unbuttoning the shirt, pulling it off to let the cool air hit Jonathan's burning skin. Mrs. Hughes hurried into the room with a silver basin of water and towels. Gideon took them from her, dismissing her with a nod. For the next 2 hours, while they waited for the doctor to navigate the storm, the monster of Aldridge Estate sat by the bed. Gideon repeatedly bathed Jonathan's face and chest with cold water, murmuring low, wordless sounds of comfort, keeping the room completely saturated in his protective scent. Jonathan lay there, drifting in and out of a fever dream, realizing through the haze of sickness that for the first time in his life, his weakness hadn't gotten him locked in a cellar. It had gotten him carried. Dr. Evans arrived just past midnight. He was a small, pragmatic beta who carried his medical bag like a weapon. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He took one look at Gideon standing over the bed, saw the furious, protective set of the Duke's jaw, and pointed to the door. "Out, Your Grace. I cannot listen to his lungs with you pacing a trench into the floorboards and suffocating the room with your scent." Gideon didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his massive shoulders tense. "I am staying." "You are overwhelming him," Dr. Evans snapped, pulling a stethoscope from his bag. "Alpha pheromones are meant to soothe, yes, but in this concentration, you are forcing his body to process your dominance while it is already fighting a fever. Step into the hall. Leave the door open if you must." Gideon looked at Jonathan. The Omega was curled on his side, his breath hitching and catching in his throat, completely insensible. A muscle jumped in Gideon's jaw. Without a word, he turned and stalked into the hallway, leaving the heavy oak door cracked exactly 3 inches. Dr. Evans went to work. He listened to Jonathan's chest, his frown deepening with every raspy inhale. He administered a heavy dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics and a specialized fever reducer directly into Jonathan's arm. "Pneumonia," Dr. Evans said loudly, knowing Gideon was hovering just out of sight. "An aggressive flare-up. His lungs are scarred from childhood. The cold shock of the weather and the stress of the relocation triggered it." Gideon stepped back into the doorway. "Will he recover?" "With rest. Absolute rest." Dr. Evans packed his bag, snapping the brass clasps shut. "Keep him hydrated, manage the fever. If his temperature spikes again past 103, pack him in ice and call me. He needs to stay warm, but not boiling. Do you have a nurse on staff?" "I will do it," Gideon said flatly. Dr. Evans looked at the towering Duke, at the brutal scar slashing across his face, and then at the fragile Omega in the massive bed. "Very well. I will return tomorrow afternoon." The next 48 hours ceased to exist as measurable time. They dissolved into a grueling cycle of heat, cold water, and shallow breaths. Jonathan spent most of it trapped in a suffocating delirium. He was a child again, locked in the damp, freezing cellar of his father's house. He could smell the mildew. He could hear the clinking of glasses from the dining room above, his father's raucous laughter echoing through the floorboards. He was shivering, his chest burning tight, trying to muffle his coughs into his own thin arms so he wouldn't be punished further. But every time the cellar grew too dark, a heavy anchoring weight would settle over him. A large, calloused hand would press against his forehead. The scent of ozone and cedar would cut through the smell of mildew. A deep, gravelly voice would murmur in the dark. "Breathe, Jonathan. You are safe. You are warm." Jonathan would cling to that voice. He would blindly reach out, his fingers tangling in the rough knit of Gideon's sweater, anchoring himself to the alpha. Whenever he coughed until he choked, strong arms would lift him upright, a broad chest supporting his back while a glass of cool water was pressed to his cracked lips. He didn't know it was Gideon, not truly. His fevered brain just recognized the presence as a shield, an impenetrable wall between him and the cold. On the morning of the third day, the fever finally broke. Jonathan opened his eyes. The room was bathed in the pale, soft light of a coastal dawn. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and his mouth tasted like stale cotton, but the crushing weight on his chest was gone. He took a breath. It was weak, but it didn't rattle. He blinked, his eyes slowly adjusting to the unfamiliar ceiling. Thick oak beams, heavy drapes. He turned his head. Gideon was asleep in a wingback chair pulled flush against the side of the bed. The Duke looked terrible. He was still wearing the trousers and button-down shirt from the night of the dinner, now hopelessly wrinkled. His jaw was covered in dark, heavy stubble. His massive frame was slumped awkwardly in the chair, one long leg stretched out, the other bent. But it was his hand that made Jonathan's breath catch. Gideon's large, scarred hand was resting on the mattress, his fingers lightly curled around Jonathan's wrist. He wasn't gripping him. He was just holding the connection, keeping two fingers pressed directly over Jonathan's pulse point. Even in sleep, the Alpha was monitoring his heartbeat. Jonathan lay perfectly still. He stared at the hand holding his wrist. In the Mercer house, Jonathan's sickness was an inconvenience. It was met with disgust and isolation. His father had always said an Omega's only value was in their vitality. A sick Omega was useless. Yet the Duke of Aldridge, a man who commanded industries, a man whose very face made society elites cross the street, had spent 3 days sleeping in a chair to hold Jonathan's wrist. Jonathan felt a sudden, terrifying pressure build behind his eyes. It wasn't physical pain. It was a crack in his foundation. He had spent his entire life building walls to survive, accepting that he was a burden. Gideon was dismantling those walls without even trying. He shifted slightly. The rustle of the heavy cotton sheets was minimal, but it was enough. Gideon's eyes snapped open. There was no grogginess. He was instantly alert, sitting up straight. His slate-gray eyes locked onto Jonathan's face. He checked Jonathan's pulse first, his fingers pressing a fraction harder before he let go completely and leaned forward to press the back of his hand to Jonathan's forehead. "Cool?" Gideon murmured, his voice thick with sleep. He dropped his hand. "Your fever broke." "Yes," Jonathan rasped. His throat was incredibly dry. Gideon immediately poured a glass of water from the carafe on the bedside table. He slid one hand behind Jonathan's shoulders, lifting him gently so he could drink without choking. The water was lukewarm, but it felt like pure salvation. "Thank you," Jonathan whispered, sinking back into the pillows when Gideon withdrew his arm. Gideon set the glass down. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the heavy stubble. He looked entirely exhausted. "Are you in pain?" "No, just tired." Jonathan pulled the heavy duvet up slightly. "How long have I been in your bed?" 3 days. Jonathan closed his eyes, a spike of sharp guilt hitting him. "I'm sorry. I ruined dinner. I took your room. He swallowed hard. "I'm defective. You didn't know how bad my lungs were when you made the deal with my father. You can send me back. I will understand." Silence dropped over the room. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet. When Jonathan opened his eyes, Gideon had leaned forward. The Alpha's elbows rested on his knees, his face inches from Jonathan's. The air crackled with a sudden, intense surge of pheromones. Not angry, but absolute, unyielding authority. Listen to me carefully, Gideon said. His voice was a low, vibrating hum. Your father sold you to me to clear a gambling debt. The ink on that contract is dry. The money is paid. He has no claim to you anymore. Jonathan flinched, shrinking back slightly. Gideon saw the fear and immediately pulled his scent back, reeling in the alpha dominance until only the soft, protective cedar remained. He let out a long, ragged breath. I did not buy a piece of livestock, Jonathan, Gideon continued softly. I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew about your lungs. I knew about the cellar. Jonathan froze. The blood drained from his face. How? I have lawyers. I have private investigators. Before I cleared your father's debt, I made sure I knew exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. Gideon's expression hardened into something entirely brutal. If he ever steps foot on my property, I will have the dogs tear him apart. You are never going back to that house. You are never going back to that cellar. Gideon reached out. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently brushing a damp lock of hair off Jonathan's forehead. You are sick, Gideon said. People get sick. You stay in this bed until you're well. Do you understand me? Jonathan looked at the jagged scar on Gideon's cheek. He looked at the exhaustion lining the Duke's eyes. He felt the residual warmth of the Alpha's fingers against his hairline. I understand, Jonathan whispered. Gideon nodded once. He stood up, his joints popping loudly in the quiet room. I will have Mrs. Hughes send up broth. Sleep, Jonathan. He walked into the adjoining master bathroom, leaving the door open. A moment later, Jonathan heard the sound of the shower turning on. Jonathan turned his head against the pillow, breathing in the deep scent of cedar embedded in the mattress. And for the first time in his life, he let himself rest without fear. Recovery was a slow, humiliating process. For the next week, Jonathan was confined to Gideon's suite. He was too weak to walk down the stairs, and Dr. Evans explicitly forbade him from enduring the drafty hallways of the estate. Gideon simply adapted. He had a massive mahogany desk moved into the corner of the bedroom. He ran his corporate empire from a leather chair 10 feet away from where Jonathan slept, holding quiet phone calls and reviewing endless stacks of contracts. The proximity forced a strange domestic intimacy between them. Jonathan saw the Duke of Aldridge not as a terrifying rumor, but as a man of relentless routine. Gideon drank his coffee black. He read economic theory for pleasure. He got frustrated with his incompetent board members, pinching the bridge of his nose and sighing heavily. But he never yelled. He never threw things. His temper, which society claimed was violently explosive, simply didn't exist in the bedroom. On the 6th day of his confinement, Jonathan was sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of pillows. He was wearing another one of Gideon's discarded sweaters, this one a dark forest green. He was supposed to be eating a bowl of oatmeal, but he was staring at the far wall. There were no mirrors in Gideon's bedroom. Jonathan had noticed it on the 2nd day. The massive master bathroom had one small shaving mirror above the sink, but the bedroom itself, which should have featured a grand vanity or a full-length dressing glass, had nothing. Where a mirror clearly used to hang above the fireplace mantel, there was only a slightly discolored rectangle of wallpaper. Gideon finished signing a document and set his pen down. He looked over at the bed. You aren't eating. Jonathan jumped slightly, snapping his attention back to the bowl in his lap. I'm full. It's too much. Gideon didn't push. He stood up, walked over, and took the tray from Jonathan's lap, setting it on the bedside table. He sat on the edge of the mattress, an easy habit they had fallen into over the week. You are staring at the wall, Gideon observed. Are you bored? I can have the library brought up to you, book by book, if you wish. Jonathan shook his head. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his shins. He looked at Gideon, studying the jagged line that bisected the Alpha's face. Why are there no mirrors in here? Jonathan asked. It was bold. Too bold. A week ago, he would have bitten his tongue off before asking such a personal question. But the lingering scent of cedar and the constant quiet care had loosened his rigid self-control. Gideon stiffened. The easy domestic atmosphere vanished instantly. He looked away, staring exactly at the empty patch of wallpaper over the mantel. "They serve no purpose," Gideon said flatly. "Everyone needs to check their tie," Jonathan murmured. "I know how to tie a Windsor knot blindly." Gideon stood up abruptly. He walked over to the fireplace, turning his back on Jonathan, leaning one heavy arm against the mantel. Jonathan instantly regretted pushing. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." "I broke them," Gideon said quietly. The words seemed to cost him a massive amount of effort. Jonathan paused. "You broke them?" Gideon turned his head slightly, just enough for Jonathan to see the scarred profile. "After the accident, after the surgeries, I spent 3 months wrapped in bandages. When they finally took them off, I stood in front of the vanity mirror in this room. I didn't recognize the thing looking back at me." Gideon's voice was hollow. It was entirely stripped of its usual rumbling authority. "Society is built on aesthetics, Jonathan. An alpha is supposed to be flawless, dominant, perfect. I became a grotesque. The first time I attended a gala after my recovery, a young Omega took one look at my face and actually wept in fear." Gideon let out a bitter, dry bark of laughter. "So I came home. I took a fire iron and shattered every piece of reflective glass in this wing. If I don't look at it, I don't have to remember what I am." Jonathan's heart ached. It was a sharp, physical pain in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with his pneumonia. He looked at the towering alpha. He saw the tension in Gideon's broad shoulders, the way he kept his scarred side angled away. This man, who had held Jonathan through his fever, who bought cashmere so Jonathan's skin wouldn't chafe, who repotted fragile ferns with the utmost care, honestly believed he was a monster. Jonathan pushed the heavy duvet aside. "Jonathan, stay in bed," Gideon commanded instantly, turning around. "The floor is cold." Jonathan ignored him. His bare feet hit the polished wood floor. His legs were shaky, weak from a week of disuse, but he forced himself to stand. He walked slowly across the massive room. Gideon watched him approach, his slate eyes wide with alarm. "What are you doing? Get back in bed." Jonathan stopped directly in front of Gideon. He was so small compared to the alpha. The top of his head barely reached Gideon's chest. He looked up, tilting his chin to meet Gideon's eyes. "Bend down," Jonathan whispered. Gideon froze. "Jonathan, please." Gideon swallowed hard. His throat bobbed. Slowly, hesitantly, he bent his knees, bringing his face down to Jonathan's level. Jonathan reached out. His small, pale hands trembled slightly. He didn't reach for the unblemished side of Gideon's face. He reached directly for the scar. Gideon flinched sharply when Jonathan's fingertips made contact. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the inevitable pull of disgust, waiting for Jonathan to jerk his hand away. Jonathan didn't pull away. He flattened his palm against Gideon's cheek. The skin over the scar was tight and slightly cooler than the rest of his face. Jonathan traced the jagged line with his thumb, running it from the cheekbone down to the edge of the jaw. "You aren't a monster," Jonathan said. His voice was steady. It was the firmest he had sounded since arriving at the estate. Gideon opened his eyes. They were completely blown wide, the pupils dark and fractured with an emotion so intense it made Jonathan's breath hitch. "You look at this and you see a ruined man," Jonathan said softly, his thumb continuing its gentle, rhythmic stroke over the scar tissue. "I look at this, and I see the man who pulled me out of the cellar. I see the man who didn't force me on our wedding night. You are the only beautiful thing I have ever known, Gideon." A strangled, agonizing sound tore itself from Gideon's throat. It was the sound of a decade of crushing isolation finally breaking open. Gideon's large hands came up, wrapping around Jonathan's waist. He didn't pull Jonathan against him aggressively. He just held him, sinking to his knees on the hardwood floor until his face was buried against Jonathan's stomach, hiding himself in the soft wool of the oversized green sweater. Jonathan gasped softly at the sudden shift in height, but he didn't step back. He stood his ground. He ran his fingers into Gideon's thick, dark hair, cradling the alpha's head. Gideon was shaking. The massive, terrifying Duke of Aldridge was kneeling on the floor, clinging to a fragile Omega like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. The room filled with the scent of ozone and cedar, but it was no longer protective. It was entirely vulnerable. "I will not hurt you," Gideon swore, his voice muffled against Jonathan's sweater. "I will never let anyone hurt you again. I swear it, Jonathan. I swear it." "I know," Jonathan whispered. He looked down at the broad shoulders shaking against him. He realized then that the marriage bargain hadn't just saved him. It had saved them both. A month passed. The coastal winter settled in, blanketing the Aldridge estate in a thick, permanent frost. Inside, however, the chill was entirely gone. Jonathan had recovered. He regained the weight lost to his illness, and his cheeks now held a steady, healthy flush. He spent his mornings in the greenhouse learning to graft roots, and his afternoons reading in the library. He still slept in Gideon's bed. It had simply become a fact of life. They shared the space, tangling limbs in the heavy-down comforters. Gideon was physically affectionate, touching Jonathan's waist, pressing soft kisses to his temple, but he never pushed for consummation. The alpha was waiting, refusing to cross the line, until he knew for absolute certain that Jonathan wasn't acting out of obligation. On a Tuesday afternoon, that quiet peace shattered. Jonathan was reviewing fabric swatches in the drawing room when Mrs. Hughes entered. Her usually neutral face was tight with worry. "There is a visitor, Mr. Mercer, your father." The blood vanished from Jonathan's face. His stomach hollowed out. The sour scent of burnt sugar immediately flooded the room. "His Grace is at the North Ridge logging camp," Mrs. Hughes said softly. "Mr. Mercer is demanding to see you. He refuses to leave the foyer." Before Jonathan could tell her to call the groundskeepers, the double doors pushed open. Richard Mercer looked entirely out of place in his shabby suit, his face flushed with alcohol and misplaced pride. "There you are," Richard snarled. Mrs. Hughes stepped forward, blocking him. "You are not permitted here." "Shut your mouth, Beta," Richard snapped, shoving violently past her. He stopped a few feet from Jonathan. "You don't ignore my letters, and you don't let that scarred freak cut off my allowance." Jonathan paralyzed. His body defaulted to 2 decades of ingrained submission. His shoulders rounded. "Father, please. You think you're safe here?" Richard sneered, stepping closer. "You think expensive clothes change what you are? You're a defective Omega. I had to sell you to a monster just to keep a roof over my head. Tell him to wire the funds by tomorrow, or I go to the press and tell them exactly how fragile his new toy is." "Get out of my house!" The voice was quiet, but it hit the room with the force of an explosive. Gideon stood in the doorway. He was covered in mud and sawdust from the logging camp. His heavy boots tracked dirt onto the pristine rug. But it was his eyes that terrified the room. They were completely black. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his alpha pheromones hit like a physical shockwave. Richard choked, stumbling backward as the dominance literally forced the oxygen from his lungs. A low, guttural snarl tore from Gideon's chest. He stalked forward, grabbing Richard by the lapels. With a violent jerk, Gideon lifted the older man completely off his feet and slammed him against the oak paneling. "I told you!" Gideon roared. "If you ever stepped foot on my property, I would end you." Richard gagged, clawing uselessly at Gideon's massive wrists. "He is my mate," Gideon snarled, his fangs fully descended. "He belongs to this house. You are nothing." Gideon pulled his fist back. Jonathan saw the blind, murderous rage in his eyes. Gideon was completely lost to the pure alpha instinct to eliminate a threat to his Omega. "Gideon, no!" Jonathan didn't cower. For the first time in his life, he pushed back. He ran forward, wrapping both hands tightly around Gideon's thick forearm before the blow could land. "Stop! Look at me!" Gideon froze, his fist trembling an inch from Richard's face. He turned his head slowly, his black eyes locking onto Jonathan. Jonathan stood his ground against the crushing weight of the pheromones. "He isn't worth it," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "If you kill him, you go to prison. You leave me here alone. He's not worth our peace." Gideon stared at him, his massive chest heaving. "Put him down," Jonathan commanded softly. Slowly, the black receded from Gideon's eyes, replaced by his familiar slate gray. He uncurled his fist and let Richard drop. The man scrambled backward on the floorboards, gasping for air. Jonathan stepped past Gideon. He looked down at his tormentor. He felt no fear. He only felt pity. "You don't own me anymore," Jonathan said, his voice icy and steady. "You sold me to a monster, and I found a man. If you ever contact me again, I will not stop him from killing you. Get out." Richard scrambled to his feet and ran. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him. Silence descended on the drawing room. Jonathan stood still, the adrenaline rapidly draining from his system. His knees wobbled. Immediately, Gideon was there. He wrapped his arms around Jonathan, pulling him tight and burying his face in his neck. The furious ozone scent faded back into grounding, protective cedar. "I am sorry," Gideon murmured roughly against Jonathan's skin. "I should have stopped him at the gate." "You stopped him," Jonathan said, leaning his entire weight against the alpha. "But I needed to do that. I needed to tell him." Gideon pulled back just enough to cup Jonathan's cheek with a dirt-smudged hand. "You were magnificent." Jonathan smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He placed his own hand over Gideon's. "Take me upstairs." Gideon's breath hitched. He searched Jonathan's eyes for any lingering fear or obligation. He found only absolute certainty. Without a word, he scooped Jonathan into his arms. In the bedroom, Gideon kicked the door shut. He set Jonathan down and slowly, carefully began unbuttoning his shirt. His hands were entirely gentle, completely contrasting the violent rage from minutes prior. Jonathan helped him, slipping the muddy work shirt off Gideon's shoulders, his hands tracing the old scars mapping the alpha's torso. When they finally tumbled into the heavy down comforters, it wasn't a transaction. It was a release. Every touch was an assurance of safety. Gideon treated him like he was entirely unbreakable, and in doing so, finally proved to Jonathan that he was. As the sun set, Jonathan lay flush against Gideon's chest. The alpha's arm banded securely around his waist, their scents irrevocably mixed into vanilla and cedar. Jonathan pressed his face into Gideon's neck. He wasn't property. He wasn't damaged goods. He was the Duke's mate, and he had finally found his home. And that is how Jonathan found his true strength, standing beside the scarred Duke who worshipped the ground he walked on. From a shivering, traumatized Omega to a powerful mate who finally put his toxic past in its place, this story proves that true alpha dominance is about protection, not cruelty. Did you love Gideon's incredible transformation and Jonathan's bravery? If this deeply emotional Omegaverse drama captured your heart, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more intense stories. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment between Gideon and Jonathan? Share this video with your friends, and we will see you in the next epic tale.